Hello, friends. Robert, it's funny that you mention that. My government teacher sort of did that. Normally, in college, U.S. government is a one semester course, but he had a full year to teach us U.S. government. So, what did he do? He started with the philosophy and theory of government first. He talked about Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. He talked about conservatism versus progressivism, liberalism, economic control versus freedom, social control versus freedom. He talked about all of that before he started talking about the history or the process of our politics, because he could, and it was important to him. So I find it interesting that you're saying that that's what you would do in a university setting. Personally, I think if I were to actually teach a class, I would probably teach Intro to Biology. That's maybe not my dream, but probably what I would be most likely to teach if I ended up being a professor. Actually, let's be real. If I were to be a professor, I would most likely teach medicine, because that's the field I'm going into, and I might as well teach to the highest capability that I have. But if I were to teach undergraduate, maybe Intro to Biology. What I would want to teach is bioethics. I would like to start at the beginning, from Hippocrates talking about do no harm, do good, care for all people equally regardless of ability to pay, and then it gets into some weird stuff, like most doctors don't actually swear the actual Hippocratic Oath, in part because you're swearing to Greek gods that many people don't believe in these days. Also, partially because it says thou shalt not give an abortive remedy, which is something that a lot of doctors are willing to do these days. We didn't have the abortive remedy part in our white coat ceremony. We also didn't pray to any Greek gods during our white coat ceremony. That had gotten weird fast. But we don't say the same version that used to be said in the past. But I would start with the Hippocratic Oath and go through the history of bioethics, talk about the Nuremberg trials after World War II, all the way up to modern day, like Zhang He, I think is the guy's name, the Chinese scientist who made some genetically modified humans using CRISPR technology. Talk about the ethics of that. Talk about how CRISPR sort of presents a challenge to the old way of not the old way. Recent laws in bioethics present a certain number of principles under which you can't use CRISPR to fix genetic diseases. But CRISPR nevertheless has substantial benefit, so maybe those standards could be modified. But anyway, under any application of any kind of moral law, even modified, He did a terrible thing in his use of CRISPR on humans. It was pretty bad. So I would talk about all the flaws in his methodology and how that was unethical. And not just health sciences, but also a little bit about how fracking companies don't do pre and post water quality monitoring at most of their sites. So it's not necessarily possible to say whether in some instances water contamination does happen. It's not perfectly clear how often it happens. Just because the pre-post stream studies aren't done. Should they be required to do pre-studies? That's another thing. Or the idea with moving species, so agriculturally, like, can we plant this plant here? Can this seed be marketed? Do you have to... So the idea of burden of proof. Do you have to prove that a plant is safe before you move it to a new area? Or do you have to prevent it only after it's been proven unsafe, as to prevent the spread of invasive species? So there's a lot of areas you could talk about bioethics. I would love for that to be a class. It's not a class I've taken myself, so I'd probably have to take one before I taught one, but I do have somewhat of a background, and that would be a lot of fun to teach. So yeah.